Ryland Moss had been wiping down laboratory surfaces for 3 years aboard the Tethys Research Consortium, and in that time, he'd learned one critical survival skill: don't ask questions. The Quveran scientists who operated the massive orbital facility didn't want their janitor questioning the strange glowing liquids in unmarked containers, or why certain rooms hummed at frequencies that made his back teeth ache. They wanted the floors clean, the waste disposed of, and silence. Ryland was fine with that arrangement. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward, and nobody expected him to understand quantum field theory or whatever it was they were doing in Lab 7. He pushed his cleaning cart down the curved corridors, the station's artificial gravity keeping everything pleasantly Earth-normal despite orbiting a neutron star that would flatten him into constituent atoms if the shielding ever failed. He tried not to think about that part. "Moss," a voice called from behind. Ryland turned to find Helix, his Quveran supervisor, approaching with the peculiar gliding walk their species favored. Helix's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, which Ryland had learned meant either concern or indigestion. Hard to tell with aliens. "Yeah, boss. Emergency assignment. Sector 7 core processing chamber. Needs immediate sanitization." Helix handed him a data tablet with access codes displayed in glowing Quveran script and, thankfully, human translation underneath. Ryland glanced at the tablet. "Sector 7. I've never cleaned there before." "Nobody has. Not for 8 months. The Science Council has sealed it for intensive research, but they need the workspace cleared before the next review session." Helix's membranes flickered, a gesture Ryland loosely translated as a shrug. "Cascade protocol failed again. Very stressful for everyone." "Cascade protocol," Ryland repeated like the words meant anything to him. "Right, I'll get it spotless." Helix departed without further explanation, and Ryland loaded his cart with extra cleaning supplies. Whatever Cascade protocol meant, it sounded important enough to make his supervisor nervous, which was noteworthy. The Quveran weren't easily rattled. They'd been spacefaring for longer than humans had been using agriculture. Their scientists regularly published papers that revolutionized understanding of physics, biology, and a dozen fields humans were still trying to pronounce correctly. The route to Sector 7 took him through parts of the station he'd only seen on orientation maps. The corridors here were older, the walls bearing the subtle scorch marks of ancient energy weapon tests or possibly just really aggressive chemistry experiments. He passed clusters of scientists huddled in intense conversation, their translator devices emitting frustrated bursts of sound. The entrance to the core processing chamber required 3 separate biometric scans and the access code Helix had provided. The doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded almost reluctant, revealing a space that made Ryland stop and whistle low. "Okay then," he muttered. "This is definitely above my pay grade." The chamber was enormous, circular, with walls that seemed to be made of seamless dark metal inlaid with crystalline circuits that pulsed with soft blue light. Holographic displays floated everywhere, showing data streams and mathematical models that scrolled too fast for human eyes to track. And at the center, suspended in what appeared to be a localized gravitational field, hung the Helix Core. It was beautiful in a way that made Ryland's brain hurt. The structure was roughly cylindrical, maybe 3 meters tall, composed of interlocking crystalline segments that rotated slowly around a central axis of pure light. Except the light wasn't behaving properly. It flickered and stuttered, pulsing in irregular patterns that even Ryland could tell were wrong. Around the observation platform circling the core, at least 40 Quveran scientists worked with intense focus. Some manipulated holographic controls, others consulted glowing tablets. A few appeared to be arguing in the rapid clicking language that translator implants struggled to process. Ryland cleared his throat. Excuse me. I'm here to clean." The nearest scientist, a particularly tall Quveran with silver markings along her cranial ridge, glanced at him with two of her 4 eyes before dismissing him entirely. Yes, yes, don't touch any equipment. Stay away from the containment field. Work quietly. Will do, Ryland agreed, parking his cart at the chamber's periphery. He began the familiar routine, wiping down surfaces, collecting discarded containers, emptying waste recyclers. The scientists ignored him completely, which suited Ryland fine. It gave him freedom to observe, and despite his determined incuriosity about most scientific matters, he found himself intrigued by the drama unfolding around the Helix Core. The quantum variance model still shows no predictive pattern, one scientist announced, frustration evident even through the translator. Perhaps we need to examine subspace interference coefficients at higher resolution, another suggested. We've examined them at 17 different resolutions, Tethys. The problem isn't resolution. Ryland mopped his way slowly around the chamber's perimeter, catching fragments of increasingly desperate conversation. Apparently, the Helix Core was Tethys's central power distribution system, responsible for routing energy to every critical system on the station. For 300 years, it had operated flawlessly. Then, 18 months ago, it started experiencing cascade failures, sudden, unpredictable disruptions that caused station-wide power fluctuations. The best scientific minds in the galaxy had been working on the problem ever since. They'd built probability models, consulted AI networks, analyzed historical data going back centuries. Nothing worked. The failures were becoming more frequent, and if they couldn't solve it soon, Tethys would need to be evacuated. 300 years of perfect operation, Ryland thought, dumping another recycler full of discarded data tablets. Then suddenly problems. What changed? His eyes drifted back to the Helix Core, watching its irregular pulse pattern. Something about it nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't articulate. He'd spent enough years around malfunctioning equipment in his grandfather's repair shop to develop instincts about these things, even if he couldn't explain them scientifically. He finished cleaning the outer areas and started working his way closer to the central platform, where the lead scientist, the tall one with silver markings, whose name tag identified her as Tethys, was running another diagnostic simulation with a team of exhausted-looking colleagues. Maybe the problem is in our fundamental assumptions, one scientist suggested wearily. Our assumptions are based on 3 centuries of validated theory, Tethys replied, her voice tight. We're not missing something fundamental. We're missing something subtle. Ryland wiped down a console near the platform railing and found himself staring directly at the Helix Core's base housing. And there, his eyes caught on something that made him pause mid-wipe. The housing was covered in a thin film of crystallized residue. Ryland set down his cleaning cloth and leaned closer to the platform railing, squinting at the Helix Core's base. The crystalline residue wasn't immediately obvious. It had built up gradually, layer upon microscopic layer, until it formed a nearly transparent coating that caught the light at certain angles. He'd seen similar buildup 100 times before, usually around ventilation systems or cooling units in environments with high humidity and temperature fluctuation. It was, essentially, crud. Fancy alien crud on fancy alien equipment, but crud nonetheless. His eyes traced the pattern of buildup and noticed it was particularly thick around 3 small sensor nodes embedded in the housing at equidistant points. The sensors themselves were barely visible beneath the crystalline film, their indicator lights dim and struggling. Thermal sensors, Ryland guessed, probably feeding temperature data back to the main system for regulation. He glanced around the chamber. The scientists were deep in another heated debate about probability matrices and quantum entanglement coefficients. Nobody was paying attention to the human janitor standing by the railing with a thoughtful expression. Ryland pulled out his standard-issue maintenance tool, a sophisticated scraping implement that was basically a very well-designed plastic spatula, and leaned carefully over the railing. The containment field around the core created a slight resistance, like pushing through thick air, but his tool passed through easily enough. He positioned the scraper against the first sensor and began carefully removing the crystallized buildup. Years of cleaning experience had taught him the right angle and pressure, firm enough to remove buildup without damaging the underlying surface, gentle enough not to scratch or crack anything important. The residue came away in small flakes, drifting into the containment field where they were presumably vaporized or contained, or whatever alien technology did with debris. Within seconds of exposing the first sensor, one of the holographic displays across the chamber flickered. A scientist named Tethys noticed immediately. "Wait, there's a stability shift in energy pathway 7. What changed?" Ryland froze, his scraper still against the sensor. Several scientists turned toward the displays, confusion evident in their body language. "I didn't touch any controls," someone protested. "Neither did I. But look, the variance cascade in Sector 7 just stabilized by 14%. Thesic moved toward the displays with rapid, precise steps. Her four eyes scanned the data, her head tilting in the Quveran gesture for deep confusion. "That's impossible. We haven't implemented any corrections." Ryland, still frozen at the railing, caught Thesic's attention, two of her eyes fixed on him while the other two remained on the displays. "Human, what are you doing?" Ryland gestured awkwardly with his scraper. "I was just cleaning. This sensor here looked pretty dirty, so I—" "Stop," Thesic commanded, but her tone wasn't angry, it was stunned. "Don't move. Tethys, monitor all readings. I want real-time analysis of every fluctuation." She approached the railing. Looking from Ryland to the sensor, he'd partially cleaned to the stabilizing holographic display. Her translator device emitted a sound that Ryland's implant struggled to process, something between a laugh and a gasp. "You cleaned the sensor," she said slowly. "Just a little bit," Ryland confirmed, feeling like he was confessing to breaking something valuable. "There's this crystallized residue, probably from coolant condensation. Builds up over time if humidity regulation runs a bit cold. I've seen it on ventilation systems back on." "Clean the second sensor," Thesic interrupted. "Are you sure? I don't want to mess anything up." "Clean it now." Ryland shrugged and moved his scraper to the second sensor node, carefully removing the accumulated residue. This time, everyone was watching the displays. The moment the second sensor was exposed, another energy pathway stabilized. The fluctuations visible in the holographic models began to smooth out, irregular patterns resolving into steady flows. The chamber had gone completely silent except for the soft hum of the Helix Core and the quiet scraping of Ryland's tool against crystallized crud. "The third sensor," Thesic whispered. "Clean the third one." Ryland complied. His scraper worked around the final sensor node, removing weeks or months or possibly years of accumulated residue. The sensor's indicator light brightened as the film cleared away. On the holographic displays surrounding the chamber, the cascade patterns that had defied 300 years of scientific analysis simply stopped. The Helix Core's pulse stabilized into a smooth, rhythmic pattern. Energy pathways displayed in perfect, predictable flow. Every variance marker that had been flashing warnings went green. Ryland straightened up, tucking his scraper back into his tool belt. "So, I think that did it." Thesic stared at him. Tethys stared at him. 40 of the galaxy's most brilliant scientists stared at him with expressions that Ryland's translator implant could only interpret as complete and utter shock. "It was dirty," Thesic said, her voice barely audible. "The sensors were dirty." "Yeah," Ryland agreed. "Probably giving false temperature readings to the system. The core sees temperatures that don't match reality, tries to correct, overcorrects, creates a cascade effect that compounds over time. Classic feedback loop from bad sensor data. My grandfather used to say most equipment failures come down to dirt, loose connections, or someone forgetting to check the basics." 300 years, Tethys said faintly. We spent 300 years developing quantum models of power distribution, and the problem was dirty sensors. Ryland felt awkward under the collective stare. I mean, it was pretty well hidden. And it built up gradually, so your automated systems probably never registered it as a problem. They're usually calibrated for sudden contamination, not slow accumulation, right? The Thesic's translator device emitted a sound that definitely translated to laughter, slightly hysterical. We have spent 18 months, thousands of work hours, consulted the finest minds across 12 species, built computational models that required artificial intelligence networks to process. And a human janitor solved it with a scraper in 3 minutes. Another scientist finished. Well, Ryland said, trying to be diplomatic, I had the advantage of not knowing what I was looking at. You all were seeing this incredibly complex power distribution system. I just saw dirty equipment. Thesic turned to face the rest of the science team. Someone contact the council. Tell them we need an emergency meeting. What should we tell them? Kethris asked. Thesic looked back at Ryland, her 4 eyes blinking in a pattern he couldn't interpret. Tell them we've solved the cascade protocol failure. And tell them to prepare for a very uncomfortable conversation about assumptions, complexity, and hubris. Six hours later, Ryland found himself sitting in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Tethys Research Consortium, surrounded by the most distinguished scientific minds in the galaxy, and wishing desperately that he was somewhere else. Anywhere else. The chair wasn't designed for human physiology. The Quveran preferred something between sitting and standing that made his knees ache, and every time he shifted position, someone important would glance his way. The council chamber was impressive in a way that made Ryland feel small. The walls curved upward into a dome that displayed real-time images of the neutron star they orbited, its surface roiling with magnetic storms that could sterilize planets. The message was clear. These were people who studied the most violent forces in the universe and made them comprehensible. And yet, Ryland thought, they couldn't figure out that their sensors needed cleaning. Helix sat 2 rows behind him, and Ryland could feel his supervisor's amusement even without looking. The Quveran had an excellent sense of irony, apparently. At the front of the chamber, Thesic stood before the assembled council, presenting her findings on a holographic display visible to everyone. She'd been speaking for 20 minutes, methodically explaining the 18-month investigation into the cascade protocol failures, the various theories they'd tested, the computational resources expended, the expert consultations conducted. And then, Thesic continued, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic design. At approximately 1400 hours station time, maintenance worker Ryland Moss entered the core processing chamber to perform routine cleaning duties. The holographic display showed the Helix Core's sensor housing, zooming in on the crystalline residue that Ryland had scraped away. The thermal sensors embedded in the core's base housing had accumulated microscopic crystalline deposits over an extended period. We estimate between 8 and 14 months, though possibly longer. The deposits were formed from coolant condensation, a perfectly normal byproduct of temperature regulation in high-humidity environments. Thesic manipulated the display, showing molecular analysis of the residue. The automated cleaning systems aboard Tethys are calibrated to detect biological contamination, chemical spills, and radiation exposure. They are not programmed to recognize gradual mineral accumulation as a contamination event. The buildup occurred so slowly that it fell below detection thresholds. A council member, Ryland recognized him as Orthix, the director, whose silver facial markings indicated advanced age and presumably wisdom. raised one long-fingered hand. The sensors themselves did not register degraded performance. They did, Tethys confirmed. But the degradation was gradual enough that our diagnostic systems interpreted it as normal sensor aging. We have maintenance protocols for replacing sensors on a scheduled basis, but those protocols were developed based on theoretical degradation models, not empirical observation. In practice, our sensors last significantly longer than predicted, so replacement schedules had been extended. Extended by how much? Orthix asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. By approximately 200 years, Director. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Ryland tried to make himself smaller in his uncomfortable chair. Tethys pressed on. The contaminated sensors provided false temperature data to the Helix Core's distribution algorithms. The core, detecting temperature anomalies, initiated compensatory adjustments to energy flow. These adjustments were unnecessary and created minor inefficiencies. Over time, these inefficiencies compounded, creating increasingly complex cascade patterns that appeared random, but were actually deterministic responses to systematically incorrect sensor data. The holographic display showed the mathematical models they'd built, complex webs of probability and quantum mechanics. Then Tethys showed what happened when you simply corrected the sensor inputs. The cascades disappeared, replaced by smooth, predictable energy distribution. The solution, Tethys said quietly, required no new technology, no theoretical breakthroughs, no advanced computational analysis. It required a maintenance worker with practical experience recognizing dirty equipment and cleaning it with a standard scraping tool. She gestured toward Ryland, and suddenly every eye in the chamber was on him again. He managed a small, awkward wave. Orthix leaned forward in his seat, which was elevated above the others, probably a status thing. Maintenance worker Moss, would you approach the speaker's platform? Ryland's legs didn't want to cooperate, but he managed to stand and walk to the front of the chamber. Standing next to Tethys, who was nearly a meter taller than him, he felt absurdly small. The council members studied him with expressions ranging from curiosity to what might have been embarrassment. "Tell us," Orthix said, "how did you identify the problem?" Ryland cleared his throat. "I didn't really. I mean, I wasn't trying to solve anything. I was just cleaning. But I've been around malfunctioning equipment my whole life. My grandfather ran a repair shop on Earth, and you develop instincts. When I saw the residue on the sensors, it just looked wrong. Like when you see a filter that hasn't been changed in too long, or a connection that's corroded. It's not about understanding the theory of how it works. It's about recognizing when something isn't maintained properly. And your grandfather taught you this approach?" Orthix asked. "Yeah, he used to say that most problems aren't complicated, they're just overlooked. People assume that if something expensive or sophisticated isn't working, the solution must be equally expensive or sophisticated. But usually it's something simple: loose wire, dead battery, dirt in the wrong place." Ryland shrugged. He'd tell customers to check if their appliance was plugged in before he'd even agree to look at it. You'd be surprised how often that was the problem. Several council members made sounds that Ryland's translator interpreted as rueful laughter. "The Quveran have pursued scientific advancement for over 12,000 years, Orthix said slowly. "We have built civilizations around the principle that complex problems require sophisticated solutions. We have developed mathematical frameworks that describe the behavior of the universe from quantum scales to cosmic scales. We have perhaps become so accustomed to complexity that we forgot to check if the problem was plugged in." More laughter, less rueful this time. Orthix stood, which seemed to be a significant gesture based on how the chamber quieted immediately. "Maintenance worker Moss, the council recognizes that you have provided a service to this facility that our entire scientific community failed to deliver. Moreover, You have taught us a valuable lesson about the limitations of pure theoretical approach without practical grounding. I really just cleaned some sensors, Ryland protested weakly. You did more than that. You reminded us that observation, experience, and practical knowledge have value equal to theoretical understanding. Orthix gestured broadly to the assembled scientists. We have been operating under the assumption that our intellectual capacity alone would solve any problem we encountered. You have demonstrated that different types of knowledge serve different purposes. Thessig stepped forward. Director, if I may suggest, this incident reveals a systematic gap in our approach to problem solving. We should consider implementing a new position, a practical systems consultant who reviews scientific problems from a maintenance and operational perspective before theoretical solutions are pursued. An excellent suggestion, Orthix agreed. Maintenance worker Moss, how would you feel about accepting such a position? Ryland blinked. I'm a janitor. You're a person with valuable practical knowledge and observational skills that this facility clearly needs, Orthix corrected. Your job would be to examine scientific problems and determine if simple, practical solutions exist before we expend resources on complex theoretical approaches. I don't have any degrees, Ryland said. I barely finished technical school. And yet you solved in minutes what our most educated minds could not solve in 18 months, Thessick pointed out. Education is valuable, but it is not the only form of valuable knowledge. Ryland looked around the chamber, at the assembled scientists who had spent their lives pursuing understanding of the universe's deepest mysteries. They were looking back at him with what appeared to be genuine respect, mixed with healthy doses of chagrin and self-awareness. If I take this job, Ryland said slowly, I'm still going to point out when things just need cleaning. We're counting on it, Orthix replied. 2 weeks after the council meeting, Ryland stood in what was technically now his office, though he still thought of it as a glorified storage closet with a desk. The space was wedged between 2 laboratories in Sector 4, and he decorated it with a small plant from Earth, a cactus that required minimal maintenance, appropriately enough, and a framed photo of his grandfather's repair shop. His new title was Practical Systems Consultant, which sounded impressive enough that his mother had cried with pride during their last video call. His actual job hadn't changed that much. He still walked around the station, still cleaned things, still observed equipment and systems with the practical eye of someone who'd spent years maintaining temperamental machinery. The difference was that now, when he noticed something odd, scientists actually listened. The door chimed, and Thessick entered without waiting for acknowledgement, a habit that Ryland had learned was normal for Quveran rather than rude. She carried a data tablet and wore the expression that he'd come to recognize as, "We have another theoretical disaster." "Let me guess," Ryland said, setting down his coffee, actual Earth coffee, now that he had the budget for imported luxuries. "Something's broken and nobody knows why." "The atmospheric processing system in Sector 12, Thessick confirmed. Oxygen levels fluctuating randomly. The environmental team has been modeling airflow dynamics for 3 days. Have they checked the intake filters?" Thessick paused. "I will inquire." "Please do. If they're clogged, you'll get uneven airflow that creates fluctuations. Basic stuff, but easy to miss if you're busy building computational models of atmospheric dynamics." Thessick made a note on her tablet, her expression conveying what Ryland had learned to interpret as amused resignation. "You know, when I first saw you cleaning that sensor, I was furious. Not at you, at myself, at our entire system of knowledge that had become so sophisticated we couldn't see the obvious solution." "It wasn't obvious to anyone but me," Ryland pointed out. "And that's just because I've cleaned a lot of dirty equipment." "Precisely. We had forgotten that the universe doesn't care about our theoretical frameworks. Physical systems follow physical rules, and sometimes those rules are as simple as dirt accumulates where moisture condenses." Thesic settled into the chair across from Ryland's desk, one he'd specifically requisitioned in human proportions. The Council is developing new training protocols based on your approach. All junior scientists will now be required to spend time working directly with maintenance staff, learning practical system operation. That's probably going to horrify some of them, Ryland said. Yes, which is exactly why it's necessary. Thesic's translator conveyed a distinct sense of satisfaction. We've been training scientists for millennia to think in increasingly abstract terms. We reward complexity, elegance of theory, sophistication of mathematical models. Your contribution has forced us to acknowledge that we'd created a systematic blind spot. Ryland sipped his coffee, considering. You know, my grandfather used to talk about this. He said the difference between a good repair person and a great one wasn't technical knowledge, it was humility. The willingness to consider simple explanations before jumping to complicated ones. To admit that sometimes you're overthinking things. Your grandfather was a wise man. He fixed toasters for 40 years, but yeah, he was pretty wise. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Through the office window, a small porthole that Ryland had specifically requested, the neutron star was visible, its surface roiling with forces that could tear apart atoms. The Quveran had built a station that could orbit that nightmare safely, had developed technology that could harness and study the most extreme physics in the universe, and they'd forgotten to check if their sensors were clean. Can I ask you something? Ryland said. The Helix Core had been operating for 300 years before the problem started. Why then? What actually changed? Thesic's expression shifted to something that might have been sheepishness. We implemented a station-wide efficiency upgrade approximately 20 months ago. The climate control systems were optimized to reduce energy consumption by 3%. The optimization included running coolant systems at slightly lower temperatures, which increased condensation, Ryland finished. Which increased condensation, Thesic confirmed. A completely predictable physical consequence that none of us predicted because we were focused on the energy savings data rather than the practical implications. Ryland laughed. So you created the problem you spent 18 months trying to solve. In essence, yes. Though I would appreciate if you didn't include that detail in any reports. Your secret's safe with me. Ryland's desk console chimed with an incoming message. He glanced at it and smiled. Speaking of secrets, I've been invited to give a talk at the Galactic Scientific Conference next month. They want me to discuss practical methodologies in complex problem solving. Will you accept? I don't know. Public speaking isn't really my thing, and I'm not sure what I'd say that would be useful to a bunch of scientists. Tell them about dirty sensors, Thesic suggested. Tell them about your grandfather and his toasters. Tell them that intelligence without practical wisdom is incomplete. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. You know, there's an old Quveran saying, the wise one learns from complexity, the wiser one learns from simplicity, the wisest one learns from both. That's a good saying. We invented it 2 days ago, Thesic admitted. Seemed appropriate. After she left, Ryland turned his chair to face the porthole, watching the neutron star's magnetic storms create auroras of impossible colors across its surface. He thought about his grandfather's repair shop, about the countless hours he'd spent there learning that machines were just assemblies of parts that followed simple rules, no matter how complicated they seemed. He thought about the Quveran scientists, brilliant minds that had unraveled cosmic mysteries, who'd built technologies that seemed like magic to most of humanity. He'd been intimidated by them at first, had felt like an imposter in their world of advanced degrees and theoretical frameworks. But they'd needed him, not despite his simple approach, but because of it. Because sometimes the most advanced problem in the galaxy just needs someone to check if it's plugged in, or in this case, to check if the sensors are clean. His console chimed again. Another request, this time from the propulsion team. something about unpredictable thrust variations that had defied modeling attempts. Ryland finished his coffee, stood up, and grabbed his cleaning cart from the corner of his office. The cart had become something of a symbol around the station. Scientists would see him coming with his mops and scrapers, and actually look relieved rather than dismissive. He headed toward the propulsion labs, already mentally running through the basics.